Welcome and hello, and welcome to tonight's webinar that is in orientation to iNaturalist. My name is Courtney, and I'm the Community Programs Director here at MSHS. And this webinar is part of the Minseed Community Science Project that we're doing in partnership with the Capital Region Watershed District. So thank you very much to them for providing some funding to make this happen. Through this Minnesota Seed project, we are leading participants through the season by teaching identification of natives, using iNaturalist, and then collecting and sharing seeds to learn how to grow and propagate later this season. So check out the project link that I'm going to put in the chat for more info on that. And we are very excited tonight to be joined by Britt Forsberg from the University of Minnesota Extension. And I'm going to pass it on to Britt. Thanks so much, Britt.
Great. Yeah, just to get started, I'll introduce myself. Like Courtney said, I'm Britt Forsberg. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I work with the Minnesota Master Naturalist program. This is sort of a new transition for me. I came from the Minnesota Bee Atlas, and so I managed a 5-year grant project funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, where we had volunteers across the state helping us study the diversity and distribution of native bees. And iNaturalist was one of the big tools that we used there. But because it covers all living things, it's a great fit for this project too. So a little overview of the night. We'll learn about iNaturalist, what it's used for, how we can use it, look at the Minseed page. There's some tips and tricks that are kind of the next level, a couple limitations, and then plenty of time for questions. So the main purpose of iNaturalist is to be this huge database that anybody across the world can contribute to. You can contribute in a lot of ways by adding data to them. So this is just a screen share or a screen grab of the top of the Minseed project. So right now, it looks like Courtney, Stephanie, and I have the only observations there at the top. But again, this all feeds into a massive database so that anybody across the world could search by the kind of animal or plant or fungus you're looking for. You could search certain users, time frames. So I've used it in the spring to see if anybody else has reported bees out. Is it too early? Has someone seen them? Where in the state have they seen them early this spring? Or where to find skunk cabbage. You can search by location, and there are quite a few other fields. But sort of unique to iNaturalist that differs from a lot of the other citizen or community science databases are that it helps you ID what you have. You don't have to know everything about what you're reporting. If you provide a picture or recording or some other kind of evidence, other users can help you. So I maybe should have grabbed the entire record here, but I had a photo just of a spider on my desk at work. I'm not a spider person. All I knew is that it had 8 legs, right? So I just called it a spider when I took a picture and it submitted to iNaturalist. But then Wild Carrot, whoever this stranger is, knew a little bit more than I did, that it was a wolf spider. And then the next user down there could tell us the genus. And then iNaturalist tends to be a pretty friendly place. People often use kind comments, sometimes just complimenting you in a nice photo or giving you some tips for ID. So this person knew that the dark longitudinal dashes in the pale midline of the carapace were clues that led to that genus. But again, I didn't know any of those people. So different from Facebook, where only the people you know might comment on something that you post. This is a conversation that I had with another user who saw one of my observations of white mulberry and knew that it's a species of importance. And then together we could work back and forth to make sure that my observation had all the information that she needed for her project. So there's a community. And if you start submitting observations, you'll often start to see the same people adding comments. So there are a handful of people who are really good at identifying bees that I see over and over. There are a handful of plant people who I've never met in person, but I see their iNaturalist names all the time. And then that can be used as a tool both for the public and for researchers. So iNaturalist likes to say, you know, the 1, 2, 3. It's so easy to use iNaturalist. You just find wildlife, take a picture, and then upload it to iNaturalist. But the step that they skip in there is getting to iNaturalist and getting a profile. So just to double check, I've moved and you are now seeing the iNaturalist tab. Is this right?
Yep, it's there. Looks great.
Perfect. Just make sure I'm not talking about something that you can't see. So iNaturalist is here. This is the web browser. Courtney and I tried and I couldn't get my phone connected to share what that looks like. So we'll just look at a couple of screenshots later, but I'll walk you through the website, which I think actually is a lot richer in a lot of ways. It's just that I don't take my laptop outside to go take pictures, and I do have my phone. So there are benefits to each of them. So you will need an account to use iNaturalist. You can enter your own email address as your username. You can use Facebook. You can use a Google account, whichever way you want to do it. I've had an account for a while, so I just use my email. But once you come in, it'll take you to your dashboard, and so you'll see any activity, if that's observations that you've added and someone else has added identification to. If it's someone else's observation that you've added identification to. If someone has looked at your observation and favorited it or added it to a different project, all that'll show up here. But the first thing that I want to take a look at is the Minseed project. I'm not taking a second to load here. So iNaturalist uses projects as a way to group observations. So again, people from all over the world are using iNaturalist and uploading their pictures, uploading their videos. So it just would be an overwhelming amount of information to sort through every time. So this is the Minseed project heading page. I'm already a member, but if I were not, you would see a little button around here to join project. So if you're going to contribute your observations, your pictures of plants or the other, maybe the pollinators that you see coming to your garden, make sure that you have joined that project. Once you've joined, your observations should automatically go to this project so that you don't have to say every time you upload, add this to the Minseed project. The Minseed organizers shouldn't have to look around and find your observations and add them. So it's set up to include quite a few different taxa areas. So I know the focus of Minseed is, of course, seeds. But looking at, we can see there is a bumblebee. Ooh, there's an added fly, a moth caterpillar, and a flower are the top ones. Because there are only 4 of us contributing, it looks like I am winning for most observations, but I expect that'll change as more people join. Let's see. One other thing to make notice of down here in stats, and you see the total observations, and then these categories, this research grade, needs ID, or casual, are essentially how good that data is. So if you uploaded a really blurry picture and the only kind of location information you included was Minnesota, that would be considered casual. It's sort of acknowledging that you submitted it and it's a thing, but it's not super helpful. Right, so this research grade is the top level where the identification is confident, multiple people have confirmed it, and someone who downloaded that data could trust it. So this top bar will always be the same, no matter where you are in iNaturalist. And so I'll walk through how you add an observation, right? The first step in the iNaturalist 1, 2, 3. So I'll just choose upload. They made a nice green button to make it easy to see. So there are a couple interesting things as iNaturalist grows and changes. They add more and more features. So you can it's not just photos anymore. You could add a video. You can add an audio file. And you can grab them from different places. If we look more at this more import options. You can link to your Flickr account and grab things there if that's a place that you store things. You could pull them from your Facebook account. Particularly easy if you've already used your Facebook as your login. If you have a whole data table, you could bring it in a CSV file. But I'll go kind of the old-fashioned way and just grab a picture. So I went out just yesterday and took this picture of a wild geranium on my boulevard. So I took this picture with my phone, and it's automatically, there's some metadata embedded in that image to have the date and time, to have the location. Oh, it's already. So I could adjust that if I wanted to here. That's sort of fine. Can add notes, but I want to draw your attention to this species name box. So all I did was click into it, but iNaturalist has a feature. They've called it the Identitron, which is sort of a fun name. But they're using artificial intelligence to identify your picture to the best of their ability. So they're comparing it to all the other research grade photos that they have in their database, picking out features to look at. It's pretty accurate. It is often a bit conservative on its guesses, right? So they are not taking a strong guess at the species here, but they're pretty sure it's in the genus Geranium. They also compare to what other reports are. Sometimes it does get off and recommend be like a French butterfly. Well, if we read more about them by using this little view button, we could see that's a pretty unlikely thing to be in Minnesota. It also sometimes gets confused going off shape. Once in early spring, I tried to add, or working with a volunteer, adding a tree. And so they sort of stepped back, took a whole picture of the tree and a squiggly tree branch with no leaves. And the iNaturalist suggestion was that it was a snake, which, if you're looking at the outline, all right, I'll give you that one, iNaturalist. But you do need to pay attention to that. Don't just automatically go with the first suggestion that iNaturalist makes. But I do know that this was a wild geranium, so I'll add that ID. Moving down the side, this was a plant at my house. And so if I wanted, I could change some of this, how the data is viewed. So I have it as public. If you feel uncomfortable, you can go to obscured or private. Obscured is where no one can see it, and so it really isn't all that helpful for other users. But for the sake of this project, actually, since they're gardens, that's probably fine. Now that I think about it, in general, the idea is that you're contributing to this global database, and so if your observation doesn't have that information, it's not as useful. But if we're using it as an ID tool and a sharing tool, that would probably be fine. And private is that you can decide who you share it with. So you can okay that maybe the project organizers see that location, but maybe not everybody does. I don't tend to mind. These are plants that people can see from the sidewalk at my house, and so I'm not super concerned. I don't have anything weird or rare. I'm not worried about someone looking at that on location and then like coming to my house to come dig up my wild geranium. But again, depending on your comfort level, you can think about what you want to do there. The last thing to pay attention to here is this captive or cultivated button. And so this is important to notice because it's not a wild plant. It didn't find its way to my yard by itself. I put it there. And so for scientists who might be studying the range of these plants, that makes a difference, right? If it was able to get there on its own, so that might tell you something about what's nearby. It might tell you something about climate. But when we plant things, we're just in control there. The other fields, you don't have to worry so much about. And so we would just go to this submit observation. It saves it. And we'll eventually go to the project. You know, and you can batch upload a bunch of different photos at a time, or you could add multiple photos to that observation. There we go. So now it comes up at the top of the list of all of my observations. All right, a couple of things, other things to look at while you're in iNaturalist is we can use that example, that wild geranium, and find out all the information that iNaturalist has stored there. So first click just brings it to my observation. All these other red dots on that map are places near mine where it's been reported. But I'll click on that species name. This page sometimes takes a little bit to load. But so every species in iNaturalist will have something like this. So you can see the people who have found the most wild geranium. You can see the people who have identified the most wild geraniums. These maps, these seasonality maps are fantastic. And so you can see that when the most observations have been reported. Wild geranium is a spring plant, and so you can see it peaks around May. By July, it's pretty much dropped off. You know, you wouldn't expect to see it anywhere in there. These other tabs, as far as I know, wild geraniums are not dioecious, and so this sort of sex tab wouldn't be helpful. But for some things like birds, the sexes are very different in how they appear, and so you might report them different times. Maybe they don't migrate at the same time, and you start seeing that males come back before females, or bees are that way, males emerge before females. For animals, there's life stage. So if you had a juvenile hawk, right, that might look different from an adult, those sorts of things. And then this plant phenology, we can look at overall, I see, no annotation, this gray sort of hump there. Those observations, no one has categorized them. Moving down, the red curve here are flowering plants. Flower budding is orange, and then 36, it looks like this blue right along the bottom are fruiting. And so you can see over time what are the kinds of observations that have been put up. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to show you about iNaturalist. All right, so we'll look at a couple of screen shares or screen grabs with what the app looks like. This is from an Android. I have colleagues who use iPhones, and the biggest difference that we can find is that this green plus sign to add observations moves to the middle instead of the lower right. So I don't think that's too confusing. But this first panel is what I see when I first open that app. So those are all the observations that I had made at that time, newest ones at the top. So to add an observation, you would click that plus sign, which brings us to the second screen. So starting at the top, you want to add a picture or, again, some evidence to say that you are sure of what you're looking at. The next line down, the what did you see? This is what kind of organism did you see? And just like on the website, it will make suggestions. And so once you click into that, it'll do its little scanny thing, analyze your picture, and then you can choose one of its options. Or if you know already what it is because you planted it there, you can go ahead and type in the thing that you want. One thing though, when you're typing in the name, is make sure that you give it time so that it can autocomplete and you choose the exact spelling or the exact wording that iNaturalist uses. If you just type your own thing, particularly if you have a typo, there's no way to link it with the correct species. And as a lot of you are probably aware, common names can be kind of a crapshoot. They might be different in different regions. And so I really encourage you to use scientific names if you can, or again, start typing and then wait to see what iNaturalist completes it with. So some time-saving steps if you use your phone and the app, which it could be, a tablet, it doesn't have to be a phone, are filling in that date and location. But then again, drawing your attention to the bottom, this red oval, marking that it's captive or cultivated. There are some iNaturalist purists out there who will get a little thorny if they keep seeing a lot of garden plants out there. This final panel here is the photo that I was going to add to this observation. And one thing that seems to be new to iNaturalist, or at least I've only discovered recently, is that you can crop on the app. So iNaturalist doesn't have a great zoom tool. If you are a person looking at someone else's identification, you can kind of only zoom in so far. And so if you have a big picture taken from far away and the object is kind of in one corner, it's hard to zoom in enough to see it. So you can use the little pencil tool, the edit tool. I've circled the bumblebee that I'm interested here, not so interested in the petunias in that pot. But so I would crop that picture so that the bumblebee was the main focus of that photo for my iNaturalist observation. All right, this wild ginger here is just because I like it. Not the focus of this slide, but things to keep in mind about iNaturalist. Rare or threatened species are sometimes a concern for people. There are some animals it doesn't matter a lot for. I sort of suspect that no one's going to come back and find that exact same bee that I was looking at. Bee nests can be pretty hard to find. And even if you let your phone automatically fill in the location, the accuracy is not always great. So sometimes when I do it in my yard, it gets pretty close to my yard. Sometimes it's the other side of the block. Sometimes the accuracy radius is my entire block. And so again, the likelihood that someone could follow up on that is not great. But if you have something like a lady slipper, right, there are plenty of people who would love to know the location of that lady slipper and come and dig it up. It's kind of like how people never share where they get their morels. You don't want someone getting it before you. So iNaturalist deals with this by automatically obscuring those coordinates. So it'll still show a dot in the map, but it's a big box, and all you know is that that observation came from somewhere in that box. You can't pinpoint exactly where. So for those observations, you typically want to make sure that you set your privacy, that you're sharing with just certain people, so that someone researching this rare species could find it. And sometimes they're kind of patrolling iNaturalist and they find their observation and they'll just send you a message and ask you, can you share this location with me? And they're typically pretty good about, this is who I am, this is why you should trust me, and this is what I'm going to use it for. But don't worry that you're suddenly highlighting something that's kind of dangerous. In a similar vein, your pictures, they don't have to be up there for anybody to use. While I highly doubt that anybody is really going through iNaturalist and looking for pictures that they can use and sell, I mean, a lot of mine, they're all taken on my cell phone. They're identifiable. I think they're nice because they're fun plants or fun animals, right? But they're not like a professional quality. But you can, in your own settings for your account, change your privacy or copyright so that it's all the way from, there are Creative Commons that you could license them. You could, there is no rights reserved. You can just decide how you want that to be. I also know some people who will put a watermark on their photo that doesn't interfere with the object they're trying to show, but just makes it harder for people to use if they wanted to, save and do it. Again, I don't know of anybody who's ever tried to make money off of pictures from iNaturalist, which is what people are usually concerned about. I do know other scientists and educators who will use pictures in their educational presentations, but typically they're pretty good about following licensing. I don't know if there are laws or sort of guidelines, right, where you provide the attribution, and that you got it from iNaturalist. iNaturalist does have a lot of resources to help you. So there are plenty of tutorial videos. There's a forum, so you can ask a question and other users in there will answer it. I think the navigation for their help is not great, that you're better off searching your question and then coming up through their pages than you are looking sort of through their decision tree and finding what you want. But once you found it, they do a great job of answering questions and then directing you towards whatever that answer or solution is. The last thing that I'll point out that iNaturalist handles automatically are any changes in taxonomy. So for plants, maybe not super recently, but since I was in college and did the bulk of my native plant identification, I know that things like Joe Pye weed have changed. False Solomon seal, they just redefined that taxonomy. iNaturalist will automatically correct that and move things to the place that they need to be. So you might notice a change, but you will always have a notification if something like that happens. All right, that was the basics of iNaturalist. We do have some time to look at some of the additional features. I think these might not be things you try right away, but I think they're all super cool things to know that they exist, or tips that will help you be a better iNaturalist user. So the first is a scale. Looking at this fungus that I saw when I walk home from the bus stop, you have no idea how big it is. And sometimes the size is really helpful in identification. So you can just throw an object, a recognizable object down that'll help you establish that scale. I have seen people who will chill their bees so it's very still and add a ruler, or the Minnesota Tracking Project uses a ruler. You are welcome to do that, but I don't always have a ruler on me. So my keys usually have to do. You could also add a note in the notes section and say, this thing was about this big, but it's a nice visual here to add scale. Like I mentioned, iNaturalist, when you're viewing as an identifier, doesn't have a great zoom tool. So if you can, crop your photo. And again, in the app, that's easy to do. I haven't found a way to do it if you submit your pictures on the website version. So again, we can see a lot of this butterfly bee in the photo on the left, and a bee that has pretty long antennae, but it's not until we've zoomed in on the right that we get some more detail and could maybe identify that bee. But as long as I'm talking about zooming, there are a couple of things to be careful about. So one, this picture on the left, this is sort of talk you off your ledge. Things like bees can be really hard to get good photos of. And don't worry about it though. Your pictures don't have to be perfect. They don't all have to be something that you would want to print out and put on your wall. So while this is kind of a terrible picture of this brown-belted bumblebee, it turns out that I could actually see all the features that I need to know what kind of bumblebee it is. I just have the right angle. I can see the right colors. So it's still identifiable, even though it's not a very pretty picture. This bumblebee on the right is overly zoomed. So cell phone cameras are getting better and better all the time, adding more and more features. But a lot of the time, when you think you're zooming, right, you're using your fingers and expanding the screen, what you're really doing is sort of cropping and blowing it up. So you lose pixels every time you do that. And so when you, like this picture is pretty pixelated. So in this case, that'd be a chance or a time where you would take your picture from its regular sort of default zoom. And then once you take a picture there, you could zoom in on your completed photo. And then it'll have a higher resolution than if you zoom too far. You've probably noticed this. You want to see something far away, you know, make your box with your fingers over and over, and by the time you can see the thing, it's all blurry. And that's just a feature of the optical zoom. If you're using a point and shoot camera, like your lens will zoom, go forward and back, zoom away. That's a different kind. That's an actual zoom instead of kind of the crop feature. And so you'll have, you know, the right resolution when you zoom in. But just thinking about that. And again, not that your pictures have to be beautiful, but we want them to be good enough that other people can tell what they are. So another feature that iNaturalist uses is annotations. And so when we looked at that species profile for wild geranium, where we saw the graph of how many were flowering at what time, how many were setting seed, this is where it pulls that data from. So this screen share is from a caterpillar observation that I made. So it's marked as larva. If it were a bird, you might see juvenile. Again, you can change sex, live or dead, these things. When you fill it in here, instead of putting it in your notes section, this adds it essentially to a column in the database. And so it's a lot easier to pull out if a researcher is going to use that data. So there are a couple of things that show up only in the app version, like cropping, and sometimes only in the web version. This add a field is something that I haven't been able to find in the app, but it can be useful. And again, it's kind of like the annotation where you could write that information in your notes section, but it's a lot harder for someone to find if they're trying to filter and use that data. So iNaturalist already has a lot of fields preloaded that you can choose from. I think the one that is maybe most applicable in this scenario is if, like this picture of a bee, maybe the bee is the main object, but I could look for associated taxa and put it in that field, and then type in the bee balm or bergamot, so that then it's linked in the database knowing that this pollinator goes to this plant. Those are really helpful associations for research to know. All right, so we mentioned for rare species that they will obscure the location. So this one, I've already told Capital Region Watershed District that it's actually in their rain garden. I found it just on a walk. But if you look at that map to the right side, that dot is nowhere near Cap Region. So they've blurred that out for the sort of casual user. The other thing is they really are hoping that you use this as a tool to grow and learn. So up here, this CR is that it's critical. So if you clicked on it, then it would have another drop down that would tell you the exact conservation status. If they know the reason for the decline, that would be mentioned there. And on the other side are plants that are not native. So this mullein, there's the exclamation mark that kind of says, stop, wait. And so clicking on it tells you a little more about it, how it got here, where often they have where it's native to. It depends on the organism and how much information they have. But again, just a way that you can learn more. Couple other notes, when you add things to iNaturalist, be creative. They're not just pretty pictures, and you don't have to have a picture of the plant or animal itself necessarily. So starting at the top, I find every so often walking out sort of shops, bird strikes. So that's helpful data to have, right? If you can get enough information about what kinds of windows or what kinds of birds are hitting windows at what time of year, that's good to know. Moving clockwise, there's an animal track. So again, we don't have the actual animal, we don't have the deer, but we can tell that it was here. Next up, a milkweed pod. Some plants are harder than others, but like bee balm, milkweed, some of the coneflowers, Lespedeza, bush clover, those are all pretty identifiable by their seed heads. So fair game for iNaturalist. Continuing, there's some scat. I assume coyote, very furry and ropey. That's another place I probably should have thrown my keys or something down for scale. I've mentioned you can add audio recordings, so frogs, birds, that sort of thing. And then up there in that, in the tree there's the paper wasp nest. So again, evidence that they were there. It doesn't have to be the organism themselves.
Hey, Britt, if you can go back to that slide for just a second. There's a question about what's the bird in the upper right.
I would have to go back to my iNaturalist page for that. I am pretty good at plants and bees, and I am a terrible birder.
Totally fair.
Sorry.
Okay.
I would say at least half the time when I look at a bird, I think, oh, well, it's anything except this common one that's in my head, because it wouldn't be that. And then it turns out it is actually exactly like red-tailed hawks in particular. I'm always convinced it's never a red-tailed hawk. And then it's almost always a red-tailed hawk. So sorry. I know that the focus of Minseed is plants, but I have a couple slides about insects, because you're likely to see them when you're out. Native plants are amazing places for pollinators. There's some great information out there, research happening about how urban areas can actually be a kind of refuge for pollinators, because you don't have the same land management applied broad scale. So although some people might be using pesticides or not have any flowering plants in their yard, it's not over the kind of area that, like, you know, one entire farm field could be treated. And so the other thing is, we tend to grow plants that we like looking at, and we like looking at flowers. So cities and home gardeners are really good at always having something blooming that a pollinator can visit. So one tip is, again, you might not get the perfect picture the first time, but add several pictures. So on the right, this is my rusty patch bumblebee from the Capital Region Watershed District rain garden. And this was actually something I had no idea I was going to see it. I was out on a walk with my husband and toddler. I was trying to divest from smartphones. I left mine at home. But of course, I saw my first rusty patch bumblebee ever after teaching and researching them for 5 years. So I was very excited. Had to use my husband's phone, less familiar to me, maybe not even as great a camera, I don't know. But being able to take pictures of the face, the side of the thorax, the back, provided enough information to positively identify it. Not an insect, of course, with the silver maple on the left side. I'm just seeing a leaf isn't always helpful. You can include pictures of the bark. The branch that I took here was to show that the leaves are in an opposite arrangement. But you might want to take a leaf picture, a bark picture. You could back up. Sometimes the shape overall of the tree, like a hemlock that kind of winks at the top, could be a clue. But I've not yet seen that I've ever tried to include more photos than iNaturalist would let me. So don't feel like you have a limit. You can cool insects down without hurting them. They're cold-blooded, so they just get slow. They're not hurt. When by cool, we're talking like a fridge or in a cooler. Freezers are not good. You will kill your insect if you put them in the freezer. But it just slows them down. And again, then you can get the views that you want. This one happens to be in a research vial, so there's a depression there at the bottom. But you could keep them in a Tupperware cup. You could keep them in a Ziploc bag. Any bees that you see out on flowers are almost never going to hurt you. They're not near their nests, so they don't have anything to protect, to be aggressive of. Yeah, and most of the bees we have in Minnesota are solitary, and so it's just that female and her nest. So if she gets hurt in some sort of conflict, then there's no one to go back and provision her nest. So her interest is really in just going out, getting pollen and going back, not in stinging people. That being said, they're not always the most gracious photo subjects. They don't always pose for you quite the way you want them to, but you can get up close and not be worried about being stung. Another tip is to be patient, take the time and think ahead of that bee. So I've noticed that the way that the flowers, the individual ones come out of bee balm, means that the bee usually comes up, takes a little sip, and then it moves horizontally, going into each one of those little florets. So knowing how bees use bee balm means that I can anticipate and be just a little bit ahead. So maybe I can focus on the place the bee is going to be instead of the place that the bee already is. It's something that takes time, but I do think it's a rewarding practice. So know your equipment. I've given countless workshops on how to use iNaturalist, and it is incredible how many different phones and cameras people can have. So there often aren't one size fits all pieces of advice. I can't always say this is where you find the photos that you have stored on your phone already. Right? That's going to be different. The age of the phone, your operating system, all these things, but take some time to get to know it. And if you're going to add anything, so the little clip-on lenses for smartphones are often pretty good, but you need to practice to know just what distance the focal length is, so how close or how far you have to be to get it to focus. If you have even a point and shoot camera, try the macro mode. That's typically better at getting the object in focus if you're up close. If you're using an SLR camera, I often have better luck for things like bees, just using a manual focus instead of the autofocus. Same thing with exposure sometimes, right? It goes to what the bulk of the frame is, which might be a flower. And you could have this beautifully focused flower and a really fuzzy blob of a bee or insect in the middle. And so again, you're gonna have to troubleshoot that on an individual basis, but just practice with whatever you have. Your tablet, your phone, your point and shoot camera. It doesn't have to be fancy. The tool that you know is better than the fancy tool you don't know. So a couple of limitations to iNaturalist. One on the left, there is a little resin bee down there. There are some organisms that you just can't identify from a casual photo. Sometimes with bees, it's like, is there a little portion of their head dented? Well, that's incredibly hard to get a picture of. So these resin bees are all in iNaturalist as a subgenus. I don't think in Minnesota I've seen a single one of them that's identifiable to species. And that's fine, right? That's just knowing that there are different ways to do science. We can use non-lethal methods. We can do some photo collecting, but we'll likely still need to do some specimen collecting to be able to look at these preserved specimens, depending on what your research goal is. The picture on the right, it has a bee, but that's actually not the point of it. It's this red echinacea. That's not a native variety. And iNaturalist is really set up for wild organisms, I guess, not necessarily native, because it certainly covers invasive species, but varieties or cultivars aren't going to be recognized, which hopefully aren't the things that you're really working on in this project. Again, some things are just hard to ID. These two different bee faces are two species, and so just how close those three dots are to the top of the head is a sign. And again, something you're very unlikely to see in a photo. Again, make a note when you upload things from your garden that you do mark that captive or cultivated box, because it matters to a researcher. Picture on the left, you have coneflower in a garden. That's wonderful. That's great, right? But for ecology, that means something different than the echinacea on the right that is in a more native place that likely wasn't planted there. And again, it's just how the data gets used and making sure that you're open and you provide as much information as you can. So along with that ID, there are some organisms that show up a lot on iNaturalist, and it doesn't mean that they're the most common. So these are the top 10 bees by a number of observations in Minnesota. The rusty patch bumblebee is down there as the 8th most common bee. Well, many of you might know that rusty patch bumblebee is a federally endangered species. So no way is it the 8th most common bee in Minnesota, but bumblebees are pretty noticeable. They're loud. They're pretty easy to take pictures of. So more people notice them. rusty patch bumblebees are pretty easy to identify by photos. They don't have any weird characteristics that you need a microscope for. And there's been a lot of public attention to them. So people are keeping their eyes open, looking for them. And so that influences how much they show up on iNaturalist. So with that, we do have some time for questions. Happy to take them about iNaturalist, about bees. If they are Minseed specific, I will probably kick them to Dawn or Stephanie or Courtney.
There was one question about if Minseed is a subset of iNaturalist, which Minseed has a project on iNaturalist that you can search for it in the iNaturalist projects, but you can definitely use iNaturalist without participating in our project. If anybody else has any other questions, throw them up there. Dawn or Steph, do you have any questions?
I'll maybe just jump on that last one, and that having a project in iNaturalist, so having Minseed there, is kind of just, it's really just a filter, right? So instead of looking at all the observations everywhere, these are sort of just the subset that we're interested in. But again, you can submit anything.
Yeah, and we have some boundaries set up for Minnesota and for the Capital Region Watershed District within the project, so it's kind of fun to see. There's a question from Wendy about what was the tiny white flower on the earlier slide. I'm going to try to go back to that.
Try to throw in a lot of pictures. This is a white flower, not maybe tiny, it's bloodroot. These are Dutchman's breeches, another favorite spring ephemeral of mine. I think that's back to the beginning, so hopefully it was one of those that you were looking at.
Do you know who started iNaturalist? Like what organization or?
Yeah, loosely associated with the California Academy of Sciences. So it started on the West Coast. Ken Ichi and Scott Laurie were the developers. And I've heard a couple of different kind of urban legends. I know a handful of people who know them. And one is that they were like disaffected Google employees, which I think is not correct. I actually think that they were UC Berkeley students. But again, California is where it started. Either way.
Cool. And any urban legends as to why they started it?
I don't know. They probably have something buried in an About Us section on their website.
Cool. Steph wants to know if pictures of harvested seeds would be suitable for iNaturalist.
If they're recognizable. So, yeah, I mean, you could try, you're not going to get a lot of people to chime in on species a lot of the time. I mean, and maybe people are better identifiers than I am, but like I could probably recognize an echinacea seed. I would have no ability to tell you if it's Purpurea or Pallida. But if you're okay with just marking it as echinacea, and you're not looking for the species, I think that'd be fine. Again, I put plenty of seed heads up on it.
Yeah, I would think too that like we can kind of help build out that, because I've done that where last fall I was out and wanted to know what something was and took a picture of it and was able to identify it from the seed pods of the plant. So it's definitely, I think, a thing to do that. Kind of that's part of what we want to see too, is people taking pictures of these plants at all the different stages of the life cycle, like when they're first emerging in the spring versus a month later versus a month later versus full bloom versus, yeah, so it's kind of fun and exciting.
Yeah, I think seed head would be
cool,
very possible, and a good phonology tidbit.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about this, the section that shows the life stages of the plants?
Yeah, let's see. Go back to, so yeah, so again, this is all wild geranium observations that are in iNaturalist in total. And but iNaturalist doesn't necessarily know, looking at it, if you have a picture of the flower or of the seed. And so that's why it's important to do that annotation. I think, yes, I can just go back. So this is the wild geranium that I just submitted for you talk. And scrolling down here, this annotations is where I'll add that it is flowering. So that's one more data point that adds to that graph to know that the flowering happens before the seeds. And it just depends on what other people have submitted, you know, kind of how obvious that is. I think things like maples, where the flowers are the only thing happening and then the leaves are there, you know, that might be a little more obvious. People might add a little more to that, but I don't, it's constantly growing. You know, the more people that join on, the more you add information. And again, I think that they must decide what fields you get on a pretty broad level. Like plants might get these 3 choices, because I don't think, right? I mean, there are plenty of plants where they have both male and female parts in their flowers and aren't separate plants. And yet it's still an option. I could pick one here.
Nice. Any other questions? Put them in the question box. Hopefully we figured out which one of the white flowers Wendy was looking for.
Yeah. Leave that up if there are things that come to you later. Or again, that's my iNaturalist username. So, right. So if I look at your picture and I add an ID, you know that was me. If you want to send me a message in iNaturalist, you can also follow other people and kind of see what they're up to. So if you know someone, like I follow the state park naturalist in Gooseberry Falls State Park, because I know that she's always out finding super cool things and putting pictures up.
Cool. I liked too that something that we've noticed is we've started a journal for the Minseed project on iNaturalist. And when you're signed up, you actually get like a daily digest of those journal entries emailed to you as well. So that's a nice way to kind of stay in tune with what's going on with the project as well. We will work on sending out those of you who have who signed up for the project. We'll make sure, I think I sent out the link to the project as well, but we'll make sure that you get invited if you haven't joined it already. And Becky wants to know, can you download the app from the App Store?
Yep. So if you use an Apple device, the Apple Store, and you probably need your Apple account password. And it's the Google Play Store if you have Android. Just the same way you find every other app.
Yeah, and they're both free, so that's super awesome. Like, it's I've been using iNaturalist for a couple of years now, and it's sort of my like secret superpower. When people are like, "What's this?" I can like upload that picture and then sound really smart, really fast.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one other comment about the app. I have a colleague who loves iNaturalist, but her husband's kind of a data miser. And so she takes all of her pictures, she gets her observations ready in the field, but she doesn't sync them. So she doesn't submit them until she's back on Wi-Fi. So you don't have to submit it the second that you take it, you know, when you're out in the field, you know, if you don't have a lot of data. I haven't noticed that iNaturalist actually takes a ton of data. I mean, I think like Facebook or YouTube actually use more, but if that's a thing you're worried about, it's totally fine to come back and do it on Wi-Fi later.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Britt, and thank you everyone for attending. A member of MSHS. Now is an excellent time to join. Members receive not only our award-winning magazine, Northern Gardener, but also discounts at nurseries and greenhouses, free webinars, all kinds of great stuff. And your membership dollars also help bring us this great programming like this. I have one quick final question, which is, can you use the Seek for the Minseed project?
So the Seek app was created for youth primarily. iNaturalist has to follow COPA laws like anything online that you make an account for. Users are supposed to be 13 or older as the Child's Online Privacy Protection Act is what COPA is. I used to be an elementary teacher. I certainly know plenty of kids under 13 use social media. So there aren't maybe a lot of teeth to that. So Seek was created then as a way that didn't collect as much information, so that it was safe for youth to use, for teachers to use. So Seek is great for identification. It does all the same things that iNaturalist does, but it doesn't connect to that global database. And so it's more of a personal user thing and less of a share your information with others thing.
Gotcha. Good to know. Well, I think that is it. On behalf of MSHS and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today and have a great evening. Thanks, everyone.